hey, do you know anything about the queer history of Brooklyn? Because there does not seem to be anything out there. And I've lived in Brooklyn for, years and years and years. My family's from New York City. I've done all this other research, and nobody seems to know anything about queer Brooklyn. And it was both that queerness hadn't been told that history, but people also ignored Brooklyn. Before like the late 90s and early 2000s, no one gave a shit about Brooklyn. Brooklyn was a place you came from. It was not a place you went to.
Today on Rainbow Country, when Brooklyn was queer. Award winning documentary filmmaker, executive producer, and entrepreneur, Wadua Wali, and Hugh Ryan, award winning author and curator. They both join me to talk about When Brooklyn Was Queer, a VR experience based on Hugh Ryan's award winning debut book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, recipient of 2020's New York City Book Award, as well as being a New York Times Editor's Choice in 2019. We'll find out about this VR experience, what inspired Hugh Ryan's history book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, and so much more.
Hi there, I'm Bennett Singer, a documentary filmmaker and the co-director of the new film Cured, which is currently available on PBS and on the PBS video app. You are listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Wadua Wali, hello, hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, Mark. How are you doing?
I am good. Okay, first of all, am I saying your name correctly? Because I never know.
No, you were one and done. You nailed it. It is Wadua Wali. Why do I do the things I do?
Hugh Ryan.
Just Wadu it. Yes.
Hugh Ryan. Hello.
Hi, Mark. It's lovely to meet you. How's it going?
Honey, it's gone.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
Yes.
Okay, I have to say
Mic
thank
drop.
you. I have to say thank you both for being here to have your voices, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. Wadua Wali, you and I first chatted, I believe in 2021, about your documentary at the time, Gaze of the Beholder, a documentary about beauty, body image, sexuality. Recently, you brought a project to my attention, a VR experience, a virtual reality experience called When Brooklyn Was Queer. Let's just start there. This experience, what was this experience all about? Because it took place in Brooklyn, New York, I believe. Tell me about what this entailed.
Well, I mean, I can tell you about how we picked it up, and then I'd love to hand it over to Hugh, who is actually the author of the book of which our VR series that we are developing is based on. My company, a New Canvas, when did my documentary, I was independent and doing more of the 2D experience. And 2021 was a decade away, it feels like already, just with everything that's happened. And since then, I met my business partner who lives and based in Australia. And he's together we started up New Canvas, which is the company that I'm currently representing and creating these new stories and these new spaces. And it was important to me, having come from traditional media, to make sure that while this new type of entertainment and this these new platforms and these new extensions of storytelling are being developed, that as opposed to course correcting like we've seen, or a lot of lip service course correction in traditional entertainment, that's been out there for 100 plus years, and not getting it right. Let's make sure that there are other voices, there are queer voices, there are people of color there. I mean, because this is the global audiences now that stories and entertainment are being developed for. And so, I can tell you the story another time. I mean, just about how I came to this project, but it was through a good friend of mine, and we worked together at the Warner company that is what it is today. And he brought the property to me. I mean, basically we were catching up over lunch, and after having left the company and just talking about what we were doing. And he is now the head of development for Page Boy, so working very closely with Elliot Page. And they launched Page Boy Productions. And so, at lunch he was saying, "Well, how do you tell stories in this new space?" And I said, "Like anything, it starts with a good story." And so I said, "So if you have a good story that you're sitting on that's maybe not selling right now, because again, this was a couple years ago, and we already started seeing the rollbacks of attitudes towards people buying television and film content." And he was saying that the mandate was white guys with guns. And so I was just like, okay, well, that makes me feel
America.
safe. Well, yeah, that makes me feel safe as a queer Black woman. And so he said, actually, there is this property we have, and it's really cool, and we have a TV pilot for it. It's called When Brooklyn Was Queer. And I said, well, great, let's send it over to me. And he's like, yeah, that's great because not actually able to move it forward. And so I looked at it, and the book is just ripe with stories for days. And I was like, yeah, let's do this. And through that, that's how I got connected to Hugh Ryan, who is sitting here, and he's the man that did all the extensive work. And I'll let him talk about, like this book and I mean, like just the backstory of the book before we can talk about the stories that we'll tell in the future on this platform.
So Hugh,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Hugh, so Hugh Ryan, you're the executive producer of the VR experience, which is based on your I believe 2019 acclaimed book When Brooklyn Was Queer. So talk to me about why you wanted to bring this experience based on your book. Where did that come
Absolutely.
from?
It came from a couple of things. I mean, first off, I should say that the only reason this is happening in VR and XR is Wadua and her brilliance and her ability to see these stories and what to do with them. I am not a technophobe, but I am dumb when it comes to technology. And so that it is happening at all is due to her brilliance and her vision and her understanding of this space, which she has generously been teaching me about. But the reason that I was so excited about it is I don't know about you, Mark, but I can say that I was born in 1978. I went through a public school system education that was a wonderful education, but we got nothing about queer history whatsoever. I mean, even basic things, Shakespeare, Walt Whitman were presented as, I don't know, maybe there's something gay there, but maybe not, maybe not, maybe nothing's gay, maybe no one's ever been gay, maybe there is no such thing as gay history. And so that was the perspective that I knew was wrong, but I didn't know what to replace that with, right? Maybe I thought that we just had destroyed all the records and there was nothing out there. And so I never even studied history. I was a women's studies major, and then in grad school I studied writing. But I always loved history. I loved these stories, and it felt like the more of them I found, the more I felt like I had a place in the world, and the more that I felt like I understood the world and where we are today. So when I started doing this work independently, I was a journalist. I was writing kids' books. I was doing all kinds of things, but this was my heart project. Anytime I would talk to anyone, I'd be like, "Hey, do you know anything about the queer history of Brooklyn? Because there does not seem to be anything out there." And I've lived in Brooklyn for years and years and years. My family's from New York City. I've done all this other research, and nobody seems to know anything about queer Brooklyn. And it was both that queerness hadn't been told that history, but people also ignored Brooklyn. Before like the late 90s and early 2000s, no one gave a shit about Brooklyn. Brooklyn was a place you came from. It was not a place you went to, right? And so there was just this silence. And when I started to do the research and I found how much history there was, that it went back to before Brooklyn was Brooklyn, before there was a new Amsterdam, that this history could stretch all the way back to the First Nations that were here before too. That all of this stuff had existed in this same location and yet was so hard to access. I knew that I wanted to gather it together into a form that couldn't tell everything, right? Brooklyn is an incredible city with an incredible history, and so many millions of people have passed through it with so many different identities. But I wanted to show that you could look at the development of queer life in one place, one city, in Brooklyn today, and you could see everything. You could see how we came to even understand ourselves as gay people or trans people. You could see the way in which race changed the experience of being queer. You could see the change we going from a rural place to an urban place. You could see the start of what we think of as entertainment today. You could see all of this stuff by studying the queer history of one spot. And if I could put that together into a package that made it as exciting, as vibrant, and as alive as the history actually was when I looked at it in these documents, then I knew that I could get other people who also were interested in these stories, but didn't even know that they existed, didn't even know to ask the question, where would I find this? I could share this with those people. And so I did that in a book, which, is what I love. I'm a big reader, I'm a big writer, but not everybody's going to sit down and read a history book. It's just never going to happen, right? And so if I want these stories to be seen by more people, particularly young people who I think need them the most, I had to move beyond just writing a history. And so when Wadua came along and proposed this idea of doing it in VR and XR in this world that is so of the future, of the moment, of the direction that we're going in. And, she made the point to me that, like, in every other medium, queer stories have come after straight stories, that we have always been the follow up, the ones trying to fit into a paradigm someone else has built. But in VR and XR, we could be the ones telling the first big, historical, vibrant, epic story. And we could set the template. And that I was sold, right? Like that was the dream.
And as a storyteller, to know that you had a book that we could call from 1850s to 1969. I mean, like we are just ripe for all kinds of storytelling. And so, to Hugh's point, I mean, like we're super excited about this first story that we're going to tell that's taking place in the late 1800s, and it's centered on some male impersonators who were real, cultural leaders. They were the influencers of their time, and like he was saying, developing what has come into play to become parts of aspects of modern theater today. And so I was like, these stories need to be told. And as much as, drag queens are a part of our culture today, wouldn't it be cool just to throw it back and say, let's go to 1894 and see what's happening in Brooklyn with women who at the time didn't even have the right to vote in this country, but were showrunners and leading these performances.
So I wasn't planning on asking this question, but I'm going to ask this question because I think it's important. But there's a word called presentism, a word that essentially applies to, history and anything that's history. And looking back on history, and history is, like what just happened a second ago. Like that's history. And so from where we sit today, currently in modern times, looking back at something, whether it's, like I Love Lucy or All in the Family or it's LGBT history, and looking back at history, but putting a modern day take on it and saying, why did they do that? I can't believe they did that. Because that's not that would be presentism. That would be applying modern day thinking to what happened in the past, because things were different back then. And so are you guys conscious or aware of tackling things that have happened in the past without judging it with a modern day lens? And Hugh, I'll let you take this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I'm so excited about because this is something that I think about all the time. The truth is, most, I would say, of the big, sort of splashy, queer historical work that we've seen, I'm thinking of things like all of the queer storylines in Julian Fellowes' work, whether that's The Gilded Age or Downton Abbey. I don't know if you've watched any of those, but they
Love
have
them.
these. I love them. Oh my God, they're like candy, right? But the reason they're like candy in part is because the historical aspects when it comes to queerness are really just our modern ideas in drag put in the past, right?
Mm.
Everybody's worried about gay marriage. Everybody's worried about, like, what will people think? And they understand themselves as homosexuals as we understand ourselves as it's all just our current ideas dressed in drag and put in the past. And that's fun. I love that stuff, right? I could eat it up for days, but it's not accurate. It's not at all accurate. And I think that people often make this charge of presentism against queer history when they see folks doing work that is largely trans identified, gender nonconforming. This is before what we're dealing with in the 1890s, really before a lot of trans language. But the actual truth is, what's presentist is the way that we look back and assign these people to identities as like homosexuals because they did not have that language. They didn't have any understanding of sexuality as being separate from gender. And if these people understood themselves as queer in any way whatsoever, it was around the body, right? We're doing work that actually gets at who they are and how they understood themselves. And what I think Would Do It is doing, my book can do a lot of the discussion of like, what is identity? How did they think about themselves? What we're doing in the When Brooklyn Was Queer VR show is showing how they lived, right? We're not spending a lot of time with them sitting around talking about like what is their identity because they didn't do that and that's not their lives. They lived lives as people who we might call them masculine of center, right? We might call them trans. They might have called themselves inverts. They might not have used any language like that whatsoever. But when we show them doing what they did, because these two folks that we're following, the two drag kings, Ella Wesner and Florence Hines, they're real people. Not only are they real people, but we actually have a lot of information about them because, as Would Do It mentioned, they were famous. I mean, beyond famous. These are people who were so important in their time. Florence Hines was a drag king who was the highest paid performer, female performer of color in the 19th century, right? She was the first woman to act as the master of ceremonies, the sort of central character in what we today know of as minstrel shows, but she was the first one to be in shows that presented black artists as artists.
And
Before
this
this, they
wasn't
were
too far
presented.
after the Civil War, by the way.
Yeah, this is like a few decades after. Before this, they were being presented as, people who just were natural performers. They weren't artists. They were just doing what came naturally. And she was the first one to be like, no, this is art. We are artists, right? These are people who are so important that Ella Wesner, the white drag king that we're going to look at, was paid by champagne companies to be the face of their product. Her photo was put in the first cigarette packs that were made in order to get people to buy cigarettes. These people were stars, and they lived these lives where they had female lovers that were reported on in the papers, though the reporting was, salacious or it was in gossip columns or it was half hidden. They lived presenting themselves as men on the stage, often off stage as well. Florence Ella Wesner, when she died, requested that she be buried in a men's suit, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time doing the kind of talking about identity that we do today. And we're not going to spend a lot of time saying, they were lesbians, and I bet they were really concerned about whether they could get married. We're going to show them as performers, living exciting lives, making culture, and yeah, doing it often in drag or with queer loves and having to navigate what that meant for them. But we're not being presentist. We're, in fact, avoiding that trap of presentism by getting into their real lives instead of trying to assign them to one of the categories that we think are the right way to interpret them.
Well said, well said. The reason that I brought that up is because I think that there's a lot of, especially when it comes to, and I don't mean to necessarily pick on this or harp on the trans community or anything, but I think while it's important to know that the trans individuals were and are absolutely important to the telling and the history of LGBT history. I think that what I've seen is sometimes there have been moments when it's been maybe exaggerated or maybe even lied about, and I'm going to use this particular reference, which is Marsha P. Johnson. I've seen where some trans individuals have said that, Marsha P. Johnson was the person that threw the first brick at Stonewall in 1969, and Marsha P. Johnson is on the record in an interview saying that, Marsha P. Johnson didn't show up until 2 hours after things had gotten started, and the place was on fire, literally. So I think that bringing up presentism, I think it's important for us to tell our history, but to tell it correctly.
I mean, I would agree with that, Mark, but where I'm going to push back a little bit is that, I see some memes that say Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick at Stonewall. But when I see stories about Stonewall committing the sin of sort of presentism, it's the movie Stonewall that put a white guy at the center of it and from Ohio and or Iowa and had
Right,
him
right.
throwing the first brick, which again, we actually have no historical backup for. Where presentism is happening, I would say, is that it is pushing this idea of gay identity as we know it today today into the past, rather than seeing this sort of flourishing of identity that was about gender. I mean, in the late 1800s is the first time we even begin to imagine the possibility of an identity built around sexuality, not around gender. All of these folks who we think about as being in the 19th century homosexuals, if they understood themselves as queer, they understood themselves much closer to being trans or intersex people than what we today think of as homosexuals. Karl Ulrichs is one of the first people in Europe to define sort of queerness, and he uses this term "earning," which is a term that is for men who desire other men. But when he explains it in his writing, he said it is the female psyche in a male body, right?
Mm.
We look at him today and we talk about him as being the father of gay identity. But when you look at what he actually said, he was still thinking about gender, right? The presentism that we have fallen into is that thinking that sexuality is more important than gender, that trans people are less visible and less part of the community than homosexuals, and that particularly looking backwards, we can say, oh, these people would never have used the word gay, could not imagine sexuality as a concept, but they were actually homosexuals. And it has been so done completely that any effect to push back, any effort to kind of show trans people, people who we today would call trans, again, they didn't have that language, historically, is seen as already biased. In much the same way that when trans people today talk about their lives and the laws that are affecting them, they're told, well, you're biased about this. We need neutral, by which we mean cisgendered people, to write these accounts for the New York Times or to research pediatric medicine because trans people are always inherently biased. But the bias really runs the other way.
I mean, I just almost want to say our third, one of our other characters that we are introducing is Loop the Loop, and I mean, like Hugh, I mean, please share. I mean, like, yeah, let's unpack Loop, and especially given what you're just saying in the context, and I mean, it is kind of one of the reasons why we wanted to start this story ahead of the 1850s where Hugh's book started, so we didn't have to do as much explaining and building. We wanted to draw people right into this environment that's already thriving, and ahead of when, the academics and the scholars started trying to assign labels and really, come up with these terms that we're still juggling today. But Loop, I mean, like we also thought it was important just to bring forth Loop, who, well, yes, Hugh, please take it away.
Yeah, Loop is a young trans woman. She was born in Brooklyn. She took her name, Loop the Loop, from the Coney Island amusement park ride, Loop the Loop, which was the first ride to turn its riders completely upside down, which I think is hilarious that she chose that name. And there's a moment that feels like such a connection to the modern queer community. I was like, I could see a trans woman in Brooklyn doing that today. But she worked as a sex worker. She, in complete female garb, with clients who knew her gender and sexuality, who had no problem with her. She was studied repeatedly by doctors, sexologists who came to write a lot of our modern ideas of what is. She was studied because the doctors were trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to be queer? Is it in your body? Is it in your mind? Is a sexuality part of gender, or is that something entirely different? And the amazing thing about Loop is she is an orphan from the quote slums of Brooklyn, right? She has very little education, and yet she is completely out, proud, has no problem with herself, talks to this doctor over and over again. The doctor is shocked that she has no shame and obsessed with her body because he still thinks queerness lives in the body, right? He's measuring the size of her skull and the shape of her fingers and trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to be a queer person. At one point, Luke brings her boyfriend to these meetings, and the doctor has like no interest in him because he's a quote unquote normal man. And so the doctor is like, oh, he's just confused. His body is normal, so he's a normal person. Can't figure out why he's in love with this weirdo. This is an incredibly complex gender experience that is happening here in Brooklyn that doctors are using to try to derive our current ideas from while completely ignoring the things that we think matter today, right? Her experiences, her thoughts, her upbringing, all of that stuff. So, what I think Loop's story really brings to this is that we see that it's not just performers on the stage, right? That there are queer people at every stratum of society living their lives and trying to get validation from doctors and audiences and the world at large to allow them to be who they are. But that the doctors who write the ideas that we today think are true and are now trying to hold these 19th century people to, they don't understand this life. they are making things up. They are guessing. And they're the ones we're listening to today. Not directly, right? But they're the ones that we have built our ideas off of. And so bringing Loop into this story, I think really helps us to see uh, just how much more diverse and complex queer life, gender, and sexuality were in the turn of the millennium than we imagine it to be today.
And it's complicated because their work lives on. I mean, they were the ones that were being recorded, and so this is the stuff that why it's just important. I mean, we're not trying to answer all the questions. We're not, trying to drive people in any direction. We just want to put these people in context and just showcase that we didn't just spring up like leprechauns in a field in 1969. Whoop, and then there was Stonewall. Like we've been here forever since the dawn of civilization. And so just showing, just life happening and the celebration of life and people thriving in spite of, these other setbacks and no documentation.
So Wadua Wali, you are an award-winning documentary filmmaker, entrepreneur. For yourself, here's a general question for you. What draws you to a project that you want to then invest your talents into?
I definitely, I mean, just as somebody who's been hooked on stories since I was a child, I mean, I love stories because they make us feel things. And sometimes, like I have my junk food persuasion, so like a little bit of a post-apocalyptic things, but I really love the things that open my horizon, broaden my horizons. And with this particular project, it was a combination of, having lived here in the U.S. all my life and not knowing these stories of people. And then, like especially when I was just reading the book, the moment that stood out for me, and I was like, okay, we're going to have stories for days from this book, but I would love, as a queer Black woman, love to see this queer Black woman doing things, like 100 years before me, and have it be in VR, like selfishly, because I'm like, why would I not want to tell a story that, where there are people that look like me? Because, it's always been something that I would, like again, going back to being the child. And I mean, I love sci-fi stories and I love sci-fi and, just the stories like even X-Men types of stories that are dealing with, race and otherness through, superpowers and but all like and thankfully seeing some of myself in some of the Marvel characters, but in a lot of the
Mm.
other types of like there were no Black people in the future, or like in a post-apocalyptic space. So my thing is just finding stories that matter and that are interesting, that I think are interesting, and then can I build a bridge to understanding and empathy and some fantasticalness, because I like while we're talking about the heavy stuff that is prevalent and a part of the storytelling, and I welcome it with open arms. We also want to like have some fantastical fun with this, and so like there is going to be a musical, part of this this initial pilot, 20-minute pilot, and we're saying that the flavors, Chicago meets Pose, and because of it takes place in a theater, so we want to showcase that theatricality and really that's also what we bring to the table as queer people. People love our culture, so
Mhm.
so anyway, I just look for ways to push the envelope and in terms of innovation. I mean, so being able to do it in VR now is going to be exciting. And our plans, because we know that VR is a limited platform right now, but part of the reason why I'm investing heavily in it now is there will be a land grab later. And wouldn't it be great? I mean, isn't it great that we're already going to have our own little setup and that we will be a purveyor and of information and content to all the other platforms looking for content. So yeah, I really want to be able to tell my own stories, and that's just another thing of why I look at indie platforms or indie ways of getting stories out there that don't involve gatekeepers.
And I want to connect something you said, Would, to something you said, Mark, just really quickly. That lack of stories that you're commenting on, particularly those for queer Black folks or trans folks, I think is part of the reason, Mark, why so many people latch onto Marsha was at Stonewall. When I moved to New York City in 2001, I met all of these people who told me they were at Stonewall. So many people who told me they were at Stonewall that you would think Stonewall had like all of Manhattan at it. And this was for a lot of reasons. Part of it was Stonewall, what happened over the course of many nights. It's not a one night event, right? So there were many people there the second night, the third night, the fourth night, the fifth night, but also because without any other stories that most people knew, even most gay people, the only way for these folks who had been on the front lines of queer rights, at protests, at organizing meetings, living their queer lives, like Marsha, literally on the streets, subject to abuse, but bringing queerness into every space they entered. But the only way you could get any kind of recognition, the only way anyone would ever say a good thing about you was if you had been at that bar during the 3 hours where the raid started, right? So I think a lot of people, some people themselves started to say, yeah, I was at Stonewall when they hadn't been, or they were there the second night and not the first night. And I think the community as a whole started to say that about people as a way of saying, like, you were there, you did do something important. And this was the only story we had through which to focus that idea, right? So I think that part of what we're doing right now by creating these new and expanded stories, or what people like Tori Peters are doing, Stephen Canals is doing, is opening up the landscape of heroes and pasts and ideas and moments that we can connect to, so that we're not all left trying to like tell our entire story through a raid on a single bar that mostly served gay white men
Mm-hmm.
in a mafia connected neighborhood in New York in 1969.
Good
So,
time.
so Hugh Ryan, you are an award-winning writer. You're a historian. You're a curator. The Women's House of Detention: A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison. Uh, this is, I believe, your most recent book, 2022.
Mhm.
Uh, is it fair to say that that book and 2019's When Brooklyn Was Queer, is it fair to say that your books are history books?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, that's the way we've marketed them. So if they're not, I'm in trouble.
And so
Now,
why
when
is
I
it important for you to tell our history, our LGBT history, our queer history? Why is this important for you?
I mean, two big reasons. The first one is exactly what Wadua was mentioning. I came to history looking for a mirror, right? I didn't feel like I existed all the time, and I wanted to see myself. I wanted to feel like I mattered because queer identities aren't vertical, right? They're not passed between family, parent and children very often. So you grow up in places with people who don't have experiences like you, and don't have the history to give you, and maybe don't understand you. And so I think I, like many queer people, came to history looking for a mirror. But what I found was actually something much more interesting. History is not a mirror, it's a window. What history enables me to do by looking backwards and really dealing with the complexity of queer lives in the past, I can see how much has changed in the last 100 years, right? Not just in terms of laws, but in terms of how we actually understand ourselves, in terms of how we have changed the world. And so if that change is possible, I can look back 100 years and say things were completely different. Well, that opens up the future now, doesn't it? Right? If I can say, like, we changed this much in just this amount of time, what could we do next? And that is where I start to get really excited about history, because it is not, like you said, a case of presentism. It's not just that we have not changed over history. We have changed just as much as the world has, and we have caused the world to change. You bring up that history of the women's prison in Greenwich Village. The reason that I wrote that book, manifold reasons, but one was that when I looked at the history of that prison for women in Greenwich Village, what I saw was that immediately after it arrived in the neighborhood, the courthouse that went along with it, which is a women's court, and the prison, the neighborhood began to be known as a queer neighborhood. And yet those two facts were never connected. 75% of the people incarcerated in the prison were queer. At various times. And yet, the fact that the government had created an institution that brought queer women and trans masculine people down to the neighborhood that would become known as the most queer neighborhood in America immediately after the prison opened, those two histories were never connected. And I thought, you know what? This is a moment where queer people changed the world. And because those queer people were women and transmasculine, because they were poor, because they were criminalized, because they were largely, particularly after World War II, black, we have erased them from history entirely. And so we have this neighborhood that looks like it's only gay white men who then changed the world. And yet that is not true at all. And so the other reason, the kind of third reason I do this is because without these stories, the history that we do have is wrong. It's just bad history, right? This is actually just a corrective to things that we have been told that were incorrect for decades or centuries. And so for me, it's like I came to it because I wanted to see people like me. But what was actually way more exciting was seeing people that were nothing like me, but were still queer and different, and how we, the collective we, the ones like me and the ones not like me, change the world in ways that were unacknowledged.
So here's my last question for the two of you, and it's simply this: this VR experience that happened based on when Brooklyn was queer, the 2019 book. What is the bigger picture? Is this going to be like are you guys working on a streaming series potentially? How can the general audiences, especially the LGBT audience, be able to access this other than the book, obviously?
So we are in the process. I mean, so we just finished our teaser for it. So we're actually looking to go into production for the full pilot later this year. And we actually were one of 16 projects to go pitch this project in Venice last year. So we had the benefit of meeting with a lot of different exhibitors from all over the world, actually, including the Barbican and Glow College in London and Arte France. And so, it was really surprising to see that there is interest in these exhibition spaces to bring this project. And so we are actively having conversations with all of those because at the end of the day, we want to make this series platform agnostic. So it's not going to be like, oh, you have to have this particular headset or that particular headset. We want it to be ported out to all of them. But as a part of that, we also want to create these exhibitions so that we can engage and partner with different institutions and organizations to bring headsets to make it an experience kind of like going to a museum, so that there would be the opportunity to view the project, but also maybe there's conversation and commentary and other things
Like
around
a
it because
touring exhibit?
exactly. And we really want this to be a jumping off point for people to go out and do the research on this history.
Hugh, anything to say?
I mean, my one last thing I would say is that, I'm super excited about this VR thing for the reason we have talked about, that we are sort of premiering in this space. We are opening this space up. But that I also have a hope that folks who are interested in storytelling look at this and say, you know what, this could also be a 2D story that we want to tell as well. I think that there are
Absolutely.
yeah, just so many places we could take this. And this is the one that I think, look, the future is a margin, just like any other place where marginalized people exist. We are always part of the vision of the future. Whenever people worry about the future, they talk about queer things. And so we belong there. But I hope that we also, through this, people start to see we belong in the present and the story has legs and people want to hear it and experience it and see it. And so I hope my book is one part, the VR is another part, but that these stories have million flowers in different places
Hmm.
after us.
Well
Absolutely. I
said.
just
Well
want to say that
said.
our partners at Pageboy and Ma Productions, like I said, this is a multi-platform property, and or maybe I didn't say it as well as I'm saying it now, but there are plans for a TV show, a TV, to accompany this as well as a podcast. So we are, just adapting to current market conditions, and so we're pushing the VR piece first because there's no gatekeepers, and so the idea
Mm.
is that when this rises, then there'll be interest in developing the other pieces as well. So we can continue to, like you were saying, be in all the spaces.
Well said. Well said. Wadua Wali, Hugh Ryan. Well said. Well done. Well VR'd. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the
Thanks
show.
for having us, Mark.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Yeah, have a great one.